tell you how to find the guy who planned the jobs. He's called the Mastermind. I know where he is. The FBI, NYPD, and the Justice Department were holding a series of high-level meetings to try to frame the best possible response to Brian McDougal's offer. I was fairly certain that nothing decisive would happen with McDougal until at least Monday. At 4:30, I took the shuttle back to Washington. Betsy Cavalier and Michael Dodd stayed in New York, just in case something happened.
FBI agent James Walsh lived alone in a small rented ranch house out in Alexandria. The house was as plain and unassuming as Agent Walsh himself. The mastermind had little trouble getting into the house, and that didn't surprise him. Police officers could be incredibly sloppy about security systems in their own homes. Walsh was lax, or maybe he was just arrogant. He wanted to get in and out quickly, but the mastermind didn't want to be careless. The floorboards creaked. He already knew that. He'd been inside the house before. The floorboards continued to make distressing noises as he got closer and closer to James Walsh's bedroom. He slowly, silently pushed open the bedroom door, and he started to enter when, "Don't move," Walsh said from the semi-darkness of the room. He could just barely see the FBI agent across the bedroom. Walsh had positioned himself behind the bed. He had a shotgun in his hands. Walsh kept the gun under his bed, never slept without it there. "You can see the gun, mister. It's aimed right at your goddamn chest. I won't miss you, I promise." "So I see," the mastermind said, and chuckled softly. "Checkmate, huh? You caught the mastermind. How clever of you." Still smiling, he started to walk forward toward Walsh. Walsh suddenly yelled at him, "Stop or I'll shoot! Stop!" "Yes, as you promised," the mastermind said. He didn't stop, didn't slow down a step, kept coming, inexorably. Then he heard Agent Walsh pull the trigger. The single action that was supposed to cause his death, stop his world, solve the crime spree. But nothing happened. "Oh, and you promised, Agent Walsh." He put his own handgun against the FBI agent's forehead. With his free hand, he brushed across Walsh's crew-cut head. "I'm the mastermind. You're not. You've been dying to catch me, but I've caught you. I emptied your shotgun. I'm going to catch all of you, one by one. Agents Walsh, Dodd, Cavalier. Maybe even Detective Alex Cross. You're all going to die."
I arrived at James Walsh's home in Virginia around midnight on Sunday. Several of the neighbors were circulating nervously out on the street. I took a deep breath, and then I plunged inside the modest house where Walsh had lived and died. The Bureau was there in large numbers, and so was the local police. Because an agent had died, the Violent Crime Unit had been called in from Quantico. I spotted Agent Mike Dodd, and I hurried over to him. Dodd looked ashen, and maybe close to losing it. "I'm sorry," I said to him. He and Walsh had been close friends. Dodd lived nearby in the Virginia suburbs. "Oh, Jesus. Jimmy never said a word to me. I was his best friend, for God's sake." I nodded. "What do you know so far? What happened?" Dodd pointed toward the bedroom. "Jimmy's in there. I guess he killed himself, Alice. He left a note. Hard to believe." I crossed the sparsely decorated living room. I knew from talking to him that Walsh had been divorced a couple of years ago. He had a 16-year-old son in prep school and another at Holy Cross, where Walsh had gone himself. James Walsh was waiting for me in the bathroom connected to the bedroom. He was curled up on the off-white tile floor, which was flooded with a lot of his blood. I could see what was left of the back of his head as I entered the room. Dodd came up behind me. He held out the suicide note, which had been placed into a plastic evidence bag. I read it, without removing the plastic. The note was to Walsh's 2 sons. It finally got to be too much for me. This job, this case, everything else. Andrew, Peter, I'm truly sorry about this. Love, your dad. I returned to New York City early on Monday morning. There was a 9 o'clock briefing at FBI headquarters in Manhattan, and I made it just in time. I walked into a formal conference room wearing sunglasses. Betsy must have sensed I was there. She looked up from a mountain of paperwork, and she nodded solemnly. I took one of the empty seats, just as a lawyer from the Justice Department was beginning to address the group. He looked to be in his 50s, rigid and solemn, nearly without effect. He wore a shiny charcoal gray suit that had narrow lapels and looked at least 20 years old. "An arrangement has been made with Brian McDougal," he announced to the assembled group. I looked over at Betsy, and she shook her head, rolled her eyes. She already knew. I couldn't believe it. I listened closely to every word out of the justice lawyer's mouth. "You are not to speak about anything discussed in this room. We're releasing nothing to the press. Detective McDougal has agreed to talk to investigators about the overall plan and the execution of it in the Metro Hartford kidnapping. He has valuable information that could lead to the capture of an extremely important unsub, the so-called mastermind." Brian McDougal had known exactly what kind of deal he could get from them. Now, the only relevant question was, could he give us the mastermind? I would find out soon. I got to interview star witness Detective McDougal late that morning at the Metropolitan Correctional Center. Detective Harry Weiss was there for the NYPD. Betsy Cavalier would represent the FBI during the session. McDougal had 2 lawyers present. Neither of them wore 20-year-old suits. They looked slick, very expensive, smart. The detective glanced up as we entered a small booking room where the meeting was to be held. McDougal sat down between his lawyers, and the session began. "Detective McDougal, why don't you tell us what you have that's important?" "All right, let's try that approach. I met with the so-called mastermind 3 times, always down in Washington. Each time I saw him, he gave us what he called traveling expenses. That was $50 grand a trip, which made it well worth our while, and also caught our attention, piqued our interest. He told us right off that our cut of the action would be $15 million. He was very credible when he talked about Metro Hartford. He had a concept and a plan that was extremely detailed. We felt it was workable, and it was." "How did he know about you?" I asked. "How did he contact you?" "There's a lawyer we use sometimes." He looked at the lawyers on either side of him. "Not these 2 gentlemen. He contacted our other lawyer. We don't know exactly how he knew about us, but he knew what we did, how we worked. That's useful information. Make yourself a note. Who would know about us? Somebody in law enforcement? A cop? An agent with the FBI? A cop from D.C.? Maybe somebody in this room. It could be anybody." "I agree with you," I said. "Go on, please." Before we agreed to the second meeting, we were doing our best to find out who the hell this so-called mastermind was. We even talked to the FBI about him. We made whatever contacts we could make. We found out nothing. He left no trail. So, we get to meeting number 2. Bobby Shaw tries to follow him after he leaves the hotel. Shaw loses him. "Which makes you think he might be some kind of cop?" I asked. McDougal shrugged. "It definitely crosses our minds. Meeting number 3 is about whether we're in or out. Half of $30 million? We already know. We're in. He knows we're in. We try to negotiate a better cut. He laughs. Says absolutely not. We agree to his terms. He leaves the hotel after the meet. We've got 2 men following him this time. He's tall, heavy, dark beard, but we think it's probably a disguise. Our 2 guys almost lose him again, but they don't lose him. They see him go into the Hazelwood Veterans Hospital in D.C. He doesn't come out again. We don't know what he looks like, but the mastermind went in there, and he stayed. He didn't come out." McDougal stopped talking. He let his eyes go slowly down the line from Weiss to Betsy to me. "He's a mental patient, guys and girl. He's at Hazelwood Veterans Hospital in Washington. He's on the mental health ward. You just have to find him in there." At 6 a.m. on Tuesday morning, Samson and I climbed out of my old Porsche in the staff parking lot of the Hazelwood Veterans Hospital on North Capitol Street in D.C. We were going to work for a day or two at the hospital. So far, the FBI hadn't been able to identify the mastermind among the patients or staff members. "That's the main hospital," I said, and pointed to a nearby building that was painted pale yellow and rose 6 stories above us. There were half a dozen smaller bunker-like buildings on the grounds. We climbed steep stone stairs, then entered the Veteran Hospital's administration building. We were shown the way to the office of Colonel Daniel Schofield, the director of the unit. Colonel Schofield was there to meet us outside a small private room. 2 other men and a petite blonde woman were already inside. "Let's go right in," Schofield said. He made stiff, very formal introductions around the room, starting with Sampson and me, then going on to his staff. None of them looked happy to see us. "This is Ms. Kathleen McGeegan. She's the head nurse on 4 and 5, where you and Mr. Sampson will be working. This is Dr. Patrick Chaffee. Dr. Chaffee is the psychiatrist in charge of the mental health units, and Dr. Mercuse, one of the 5 excellent therapists who work at the hospital." I've explained the very delicate situation to Ms. McGeegan, Dr. Chaffee, and Dr. Mercuse. To be candid with you, nobody's completely comfortable with this, but we understand that we don't have a choice. I needed their cooperation, so I figured it was a good idea to try to make friends. "Detective Sampson and I will be in and out of here as quickly as is humanly possible," I said. "We do have reason to believe that the killer is, or at least was, a patient at the hospital. I don't know if this makes it better or worse, but I'm a psychologist. I went to Hopkins. I worked as a psych aide at McLean Hospital and also the Institute for Living. I think I'll fit in on the wards. Detective Sampson and I will need to look at the nursing reports and any case conference reports for all patients. Then I'll check the daily charts from our most promising leads. We'll work the 7 to 3:30 shift today." At 7 o'clock, Sampson and I went on duty at Hazelwood. I was a mental health counselor, and he was a porter. And the mastermind, who was he?
That morning, somewhere on the 5th floor of Hazelwood, the mastermind was incredibly pissed off at his doctor. The useless, worthless quack had taken away his privileges to go off the hospital grounds. The shrink wanted to know why he seemed different lately. What was going on? What was he holding back, holding inside? He stewed in his pitiful little room on the 5th floor. He got angrier and angrier. Who was he really furious at, besides the shrink? He thought about it. Then he sat down and wrote some hate mail. "Mr. Patrick Lee, owner. Dear Sir, I don't fucking understand you. I signed our lease with amendments we agreed upon in good faith. I've held up my end of the deal, and you have not. You conduct yourself as if you are purposely defying our lease. Let me remind you, Mr. Lee, that while you may be the owner of this apartment, once you take my money, it is my home. This letter will show, for the record, the illegal actions you have taken against me. You must cease and desist posting eviction notices on my door. I have paid the rent every month and on time. You must stop calling me, rambling on in your loud Cantonese gibberish and bothering me. Stop harassing me. I ask you one last time. Stop harassing me immediately, or I will harass you." He stopped writing. Then he thought long and hard about the letter he'd just written. He was losing it, wasn't he? He was going to blow. He shut down his PC and went out into the hallway of the ward. He put on his usual passive and slightly out-of-it face. The nuts were out in all of their glory. Nuts in ratty bathrobes, nuts in squeaky wheelchairs, nuts in the nude. Sometimes, more often than not, he found it impossible to believe that he was here. Of course, that was the point, wasn't it? No one would guess that he was the mastermind. No one would ever find him here. He was perfectly safe. And then he saw Detective Alex Cross.
Shifts at the Veterans Hospital began with a 30-minute nursing report come coffee